A CEO had a one-night stand with a gorgeous woman who had tragically lost her husband on the first night of her marriage. He fell in love with her and proposed to her. But end will shock you. Hi, beautiful Mr. Peter family. Welcome to Mr. Peter Stories. Father, I pray today for those whose eyes have grown weak with sorrow, whose soul and body are weighed down by grief, and whose strength may be failing. Lord, pour out your mercy upon them. Let your face shine upon them and save them in your unfailing love. Today, I'm not feeling well, so please keep me in your prayers. Also, how much did you enjoy the last story? Don't forget to share your thoughts in the comments. Now, let's proceed. Brandon King stood motionless at the floor-to-ceiling windows of his San Francisco office, watching the evening fog roll across the bay like a silk curtain drawn across the stage of his success. At 34, he was the embodiment of Silicon Valley achievement, founder and CEO of Techvant Solutions, a company he'd built from a cramped garage in Palo Alto to its current 40-story headquarters overlooking the financial district. The September sun was setting, painting the fog in hues of amber and rose gold, a sight that would have inspired awe in most people. But Brandon barely noticed it anymore. His reflection in the triple-paned glass told the story of a man who had everything and nothing at once. Impeccably tailored Tom Ford suit, custom-made Oxford shoes, and a Patek Philippe watch that cost more than most cars. All the trappings of success that felt increasingly hollow with each passing day. His dark hair, still thick but starting to grey slightly at the temples, was perfectly styled, though his hazel eyes carried the weight of too many sleepless nights spent chasing the next big deal, the next innovation, the next distraction from the emptiness that seemed to follow him everywhere. The office itself was a study in carefully curated minimalism, all clean lines and muted tones, designed by the same firm that had done spaces for the biggest names in tech. The massive mahogany desk, imported from Italy, held only a laptop, a single notebook, and a small silver frame that had been turned face down months ago. Brandon couldn't remember exactly when he'd stopped looking at the photo of his family, his parents beaming with pride at his Stanford graduation, before the cancer took his father and before his mother retreated into a shell of grief in their Monterey home. A gentle knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. Mr. King, his executive assistant Parker, stood in the doorway, tablet in hand. The board members are assembled in the main conference room for the quarterly review. Brandon nodded, straightening his tie more out of habit than necessity. Thank you, Parker. Have the Q3 projections been updated with the latest acquisition data? Yes, sir. Skylar Reed has prepared a comprehensive presentation on the merger implications. Parker hesitated for a moment. She's particularly interested in discussing the Asian market expansion strategy. Of course she was. Skylar, his COO, had been pushing aggressively for control of the international division, and Brandon knew she saw herself as the natural successor to his position. She was brilliant, ruthlessly efficient, and completely devoted to the company's success. Qualities that had made her invaluable, but also increasingly difficult to manage as her ambitions grew. Brandon gathered his laptop and made his way through the office's open floor plan, past rows of standing desks where engineers and developers were still hard at work, despite the late hour. The space hummed with the energy of creation, the soft clicking of keyboards, murmured conversations about code architecture, and the occasional burst of laughter from the game room he'd installed to boost morale. It should have felt alive, vibrant, exciting. Instead, it all seemed like an elaborate performance, a play where everyone knew their lines but had forgotten why they were performing in the first place. The weight of leadership had never felt heavier than it did lately. Brandon had started Techvant with a vision of creating technology that would genuinely improve people's lives. Their first product, a revolutionary healthcare monitoring system, had saved thousands of lives. But somewhere along the way, amid the pressure of quarterly earnings reports and shareholder expectations, that vision had become blurred. The company was more profitable than ever, but the soul of innovation that had driven its creation seemed to be slipping away. As he approached the conference room, Brandon could see the board members through the glass walls, 12 of the most influential figures in Silicon Valley, all waiting to hear how he planned to keep the growth trajectory climbing ever upward. Among them sat James Chen, his first investor and mentor, now in his 70s, but still sharp as ever. James had believed in Brandon when TechVant was nothing more than an idea and a business plan sketched out on the back of a napkin at a Palo Alto coffee shop. Before entering, Brandon paused at the reflection in the glass doors. He adjusted his expression into the mask of confident leadership that everyone expected to see. The visionary CEO, the tech wunderkind who had turned a startup into a billion-dollar enterprise before his 35th birthday. It was a role he had perfected over the years, but lately the mask felt heavier than ever. The enormous conference table was crafted from a single piece of reclaimed redwood, another careful choice meant to reflect TechVant's commitment to sustainability while showcasing its success. The room's lighting automatically adjusted as Brandon entered, the smart building system he'd helped design, recognizing his presence and creating the optimal environment for the presentation ahead. "Good evening, everyone," Brandon began, his voice carrying the assured tone that had become his trademark. "Before we dive into the quarterly numbers, I want to discuss something that I believe is crucial to TechVant's future." As he launched into his presentation, Brandon's mind wandered momentarily to the conversation he'd had with James earlier that week. The older man had pulled him aside after a charity gala, concern evident in his eyes. "Brandon, my boy," he'd said, his voice carrying the weight of years of wisdom, "you've built something remarkable here. But don't forget what I told you when you were just starting out. A company is like a living thing. It needs more than just profits to thrive. It needs heart." Heart. The word had stayed with him, echoing in his thoughts during sleepless nights spent staring at the ceiling of his Pacific Heights penthouse. His personal life was a carefully maintained facade of bachelor sophistication, charity galas, tech conferences, the occasional carefully orchestrated appearance in the society pages. But real connections? Those had become as rare as the vintage wines in his carefully curated cellar. His last serious relationship had ended 2 years ago, when Caroline, a brilliant neurosurgeon, had finally tired of competing with TechVant for his attention. "You're married to that company, Brandon," she'd said as she packed her things. "There's no room for anyone else in your life." He hadn't argued, because he couldn't deny the truth in her words. The board meeting continued, with Skylar presenting her plans for Asian market expansion. Brandon watched her command the room with her usual precision, noting how the board members leaned forward in their chairs, captivated by her vision. She was everything a modern tech executive should be, brilliant, driven, and utterly focused on success. Sometimes Brandon wondered if she was simply a more evolved version of himself, someone who had managed to eliminate the nagging doubt and emotional complexity that he still struggled with. As the meeting drew to a close, Brandon found himself once again at his office windows, watching as the last traces of sunset faded into the fog. The city was transforming into its nighttime self, a glittering maze of lights and possibilities. Somewhere out there, life was happening, real life, with all its mess and joy and unpredictability. But here in his perfectly appointed corner office, time seemed to stand still. His phone buzzed with a calendar notification: Tech Innovation Summit, Chicago, keynote speaker. The annual conference was approaching, another opportunity to stand on stage and inspire the next generation of entrepreneurs with tales of TechVant's success. Brandon had given variations of the same speech dozens of times, but this year, something felt different. There was a restlessness in him, a growing sense that something needed to change. Parker appeared in the doorway again, this time with a stack of documents requiring his signature. "Will you be needing anything else tonight, Mr. King?" Brandon looked at his watch. 9:45 p.m. Another late night in a seemingly endless string of them. "No, thank you, Parker. You should head home. It's late." As his assistant left, Brandon's gaze fell on the face-down photo frame on his desk. With a sudden decisiveness, he picked it up, looking at the smiling faces of his parents for the first time in months. His father's words from years ago came back to him. "Success isn't worth much if you don't have anyone to share it with, son." The memory stirred something in him, a realization that despite all his achievements, he had somehow lost sight of what truly mattered. The upcoming summit in Chicago loomed in his mind, but instead of feeling like another obligation, it suddenly seemed like an opportunity. For what? He wasn't sure, but something in him knew that change was coming. Brandon gathered his things, deciding to walk home instead of calling his usual car service. As he stepped out into the San Francisco night, the fog had cleared, slightly, revealing glimpses of stars above the city lights. For the first time in longer than he could remember, he felt something stirring in his chest, not the familiar drive of ambition or the weight of responsibility, but something else, something that felt remarkably like hope. Little did he know that in a few weeks' time at that conference in Chicago, his carefully constructed world would be turned upside down by a chance encounter with a young entrepreneur from Detroit, a meeting that would challenge everything he thought he knew about success, love, and the price of second chances. Chapter 2. Detroit Dreams. The gentle hum of her laptop was the only sound in Elise Perry's modest apartment in downtown Detroit, where the soft glow of the screen illuminated her face in the gathering dusk. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard, trembling slightly as she stared at the unfinished grant application that could make or break her startup. At 22, she carried herself with a grace that belied her years, though her dark eyes held shadows of experiences no young woman should have to bear. The autumn wind whistled through the slight gap in her apartment window, carrying with it the familiar sounds of the city she'd known all her life. Detroit wasn't just her hometown. It was the canvas upon which she'd painted all her dreams, first with Aidan, and now, somehow, without him. The thought of her late husband sent a familiar ache through her chest, but she pushed through it, just as she'd learned to do over the past year. Her small living room had become command central for her fledgling company, HealthBridge Solutions. Post-it notes covered one entire wall, forming a colorful mosaic of ideas, code snippets, and to-do lists. Her coffee table was buried under programming manuals and medical journals, research for the healthcare app she was developing to help underserved communities access better medical care. It was the kind of project that would have made Aidan proud. Elise stood up, needing to move, to shake off the memories that threatened to overwhelm her. She walked to the window, pressing her forehead against the cool glass. Below, Woodward Avenue pulsed with life. People hurrying home from work, the queue-line streetcar gliding past, carrying passengers through the heart of the city. Detroit was changing, evolving, rebuilding itself just as she was trying to do. "Baby girl, you need to start living again." Her mother's words from breakfast that morning echoed in her mind. Diane Perry was a force of nature, a woman who had raised 3 children on her own while working as an ER nurse at Detroit Medical Center. She'd been Elise's rock after Aidan's death, but lately, her gentle pushing toward moving on felt like pressure Elise wasn't ready to handle. The gold band on her finger caught the light as she reached for her cup of now-cold coffee. She still wore it, though she'd moved it to her right hand 6 months ago, a compromise between holding on and letting go. The ring was a constant reminder of that perfect day that had turned into a nightmare, of promises that never had the chance to be kept. Memories of her wedding day flooded back, unbidden but crystal clear. It had been a small ceremony at Hartford Memorial Baptist Church, where both their families had worshipped for generations. Aidan had looked so handsome in his suit, his smile brighter than the August sun streaming through the stained-glass windows. They'd been high school sweethearts, the kind of love story people write movies about, the star quarterback and the brilliant computer science nerd who tutored him in math. The irony wasn't lost on her that their last perfect moment had been cutting their wedding cake. Hours later, driving to their hotel near Metro Airport for their first night as husband and wife, a drunk driver had run a red light. The impact had been instantaneous. Elise had woken up 3 days later in the hospital to the news that Aidan was gone. A notification pinged on her laptop, pulling her back to the present. It was an email from the Chicago Tech Innovation Summit confirming her spot as a presenter in the Emerging Innovators Showcase. Her hand instinctively went to her throat, where anxiety formed a tight knot. Public speaking had always been Aidan's thing. He could charm a room full of strangers without breaking a sweat, but now it was her turn to step into the spotlight, to fight for her dreams. Her best friend Zoe's voice message played in her head. "Girl, you're going to kill it in Chicago. This is your chance to show those tech bros what Detroit innovation looks like." Zoe had been her cheerleader through everything, the grief, the late-night coding sessions, the moments when giving up seemed like the only option. Elise returned to her laptop, pulling up the presentation she'd been working on. The HealthBridge app interface glowed on the screen, clean, intuitive, and built with the kind of attention to detail that came from personal experience. She'd started developing it during those endless nights after Aidan's death, when sleep was impossible and coding was the only thing that kept her mind from spinning into darkness. The idea had come from watching her mother's struggles at the hospital, seeing how many patients fell through the cracks of the healthcare system simply because they couldn't navigate its complexity. The app would serve as a bridge, connecting patients with resources, simplifying medical jargon, and helping people advocate for themselves in a system that often seemed designed to exclude them. A text message lit up her phone, her older brother Marcus checking in. "Don't forget to eat, Brainiac. I'm bringing over Mum's jambalaya tomorrow." Her family's constant presence was both comforting and sometimes suffocating. They meant well, but none of them quite understood that she wasn't just grieving Aidan. She was also trying to find herself in this new, unexpected version of her life. The street lights were coming on outside, casting long shadows across her hardwood floors. On her desk, next to her external monitor, sat a framed photo from her college graduation at the University of Michigan. Aidan had lifted her off her feet, both of them laughing, her cap askew. They'd had so many plans: her tech career, his teaching ambitions, the family they'd wanted to start. Now all those dreams had to be reimagined, reshaped into something new. Elise pulled her cream-colored cardigan tighter around her shoulders, a shield against more than just the autumn chill. Her natural hair was pulled back in a neat bun, professional and practical for the long hours she spent working. She caught her reflection in the darkened window, young, determined, and carrying a weight that most people her age couldn't comprehend. The grant application beckoned from her screen. The Detroit Innovation Fund was offering seed money to local startups, and winning it would mean being able to hire her first employee, maybe even rent a proper office space. Her fingertips returned to the keyboard, finding their rhythm as she poured her vision onto the page. "Healthcare isn't just about treating illness," she typed. "It's about empowering people to take control of their well-being. In communities like Detroit, where medical resources are often stretched thin, technology can be the bridge that connects patients with the care they need." Hours slipped by as she worked, the city noise fading into white background noise. It wasn't until her phone buzzed with another text from Zoe that she realized it was nearly midnight. Girl, tell me you're not still working. You need your beauty sleep before Chicago. Those venture capitalists won't know what hit them." Elise smiled despite herself. Zoe, with her unflagging optimism, couldn't understand why Elise was so nervous about the upcoming summit. It wasn't just about presenting her company. It was about stepping out of the safe bubble she'd created for herself in Detroit. The thought of networking, of having to engage with strangers on a personal level, made her stomach churn. She saved her work and closed the laptop, but sleep felt distant. Instead, she walked to the small balcony of her apartment, stepping out into the cool night air. The Renaissance Center towers dominated the skyline, their lights a reminder of Detroit's resilience, its refusal to be defined by its past struggles. From her 11th floor vantage point, she could see the Detroit River, its dark waters reflecting the city lights. Somewhere across that river was Canada, and beyond that, a whole world of possibilities she'd once planned to explore with Aidan. Now she would have to be brave enough to explore them on her own. A shooting star streaked across the sky, and for a moment Elise felt a familiar tightness in her throat. Aidan had loved astronomy, could name every constellation. He would have made a wish, probably something silly just to make her laugh. She closed her eyes, making her own wish. Not for the pain to go away, but for the strength to build something meaningful from it. Back inside, she finally prepared for bed, going through her nightly routine with mechanical precision. Her bathroom mirror reflected a young woman trying to bridge the gap between who she had been and who she needed to become. The Chicago summit was less than 2 weeks away, and with it would come opportunities she couldn't yet imagine. As she lay in bed, the distant sound of a train whistle echoed through the city, a lonely, haunting sound that seemed to carry all her uncertainty into the night. Her last thoughts before drifting off were not of code or business plans, but of Aidan's last words to her that wedding night. "You're going to change the world someday, Ellie. I just know it." Little did she know that in Chicago, fate had plans that would test her heart in ways she never expected, bringing her face to face with a man who would challenge everything she thought she knew about love, loss, and second chances. Brandon King's name meant nothing to her now, but soon it would mean everything. Chapter 3. The Conference. The Chicago Tech Innovation Summit transformed the massive McCormick Place Convention Center into a buzzing epicenter of ambition and innovation. Lake Michigan stretched like polished steel under an October sky, while inside, the future was being shaped one presentation at a time. In the green room, Brandon King adjusted his Ermenegildo Zegna tie, reviewing his keynote speech notes, though he'd delivered similar talks countless times before. Something felt different today, a restlessness he couldn't quite name. Skylar Reid's voice carried through his earpiece. "Remember to emphasize the Asian market expansion during the Q&A." She'd flown in specifically to manage his presentation, though he suspected it was more about monitoring than supporting. Meanwhile, in the women's restroom, Elise Perry stood before the mirror, practicing her pitch to her reflection. Her charcoal grey blazer and cream silk blouse were carefully chosen to project professionalism, though her hands still trembled slightly as she smoothed down her hair. The weight of her laptop bag across her shoulder felt like armor. "Hey, Detroit!" Zoe's arrival brought warmth to the sterile space. She'd flown in for moral support, looking fresh despite the early flight. Ready to show these tech bros what real innovation looks like. She pulled out a lipstick. Power Red, she called it, and handed it to Elise. "Your signature shade. Can't conquer the tech world without it." The main auditorium filled quickly, excitement building for Brandon's keynote. His reputation preceded him. The Silicon Valley wunderkind who'd built TechVant from a garage startup into a tech giant. But as he took the stage, something unexpected happened. "Innovation isn't just about technology," he began, deviating from his scripted opening. "It's about seeing the gaps in people's lives and finding ways to bridge them. Every successful company starts with a simple question: how can we make life better? In the back of the hall, Elise found herself drawn in despite her initial skepticism. She'd expected another ego-driven tech CEO, but there was something different in his voice, a note of questioning that seemed to go deeper than the rehearsed presentation. Brandon felt it too, a shift in his usual polished performance. Maybe it was the early morning flight from San Francisco, or the third cup of coffee, or the weight of recent doubts about his company's direction. Whatever the reason, he found himself speaking more from the heart than the carefully prepared notes. "We talk a lot about success in this industry," he continued, moving away from the podium. "We measure it in valuations, market share, user engagement. But lately, I've been asking myself, what are we really building? What legacy are we leaving?" From her seat, Skylar's perfect eyebrows drew together. This wasn't the speech they'd rehearsed, but Brandon couldn't stop himself. The words were flowing from somewhere deeper now, somewhere more authentic. During the Q&A session, a question cut through the usual corporate softball pitches. "Mr. King, with TechVant's focus on expansion into Asian markets, are you concerned about losing touch with your original mission of accessibility and social impact?" Brandon caught Skylar shifting forward in her seat, ready to intercept. But again, something pushed him toward honesty. "It's a valid concern," he admitted, "and one I wrestle with daily. Perhaps it's time for us to refocus on what made us start this journey in the first place. The desire to make a real difference in people's lives." Later, during the Emerging Innovators Showcase, Brandon found himself drawn to a simple but elegant display about healthcare accessibility. The booth wasn't flashy, but the data visualizations were compelling, telling a story of need and possibility. Elise was deep in conversation with a potential investor when she felt his presence. Looking up, she found herself face to face with Brandon King. The keynote speaker's presence was even more commanding up close, but what struck her was the genuine interest in his eyes as he studied her presentation materials. "HealthBridge Solutions," he read from the display. "I'd love to hear more about what you're working on." Their eyes met, and for a moment the bustling exhibition hall seemed to fade away. Neither could have known it then, but this chance encounter would change both their lives forever. "Of course," she said, recovering her professional composure. "HealthBridge is designed to bridge the gap between healthcare providers and underserved communities." As she launched into her pitch, she felt the familiar passion for her project override her natural reserve. Brandon listened intently, asking thoughtful questions that showed he was genuinely engaging with the concept, not just making a courtesy visit. The conversation flowed naturally from healthcare accessibility to the broader implications of technology in social change. "These user interface solutions for elderly patients," he noted, studying her demos. "They're brilliant in their simplicity. Most companies overcomplicate accessibility features." "Because most companies design from the top down," Elise responded. "We believe in building from the community up." Their discussion attracted a small crowd, other conference attendees drawn by the intensity of their exchange. Even Skylar, hovering at the edges of the gathering, had to admit there was something compelling about the young entrepreneur's vision. "Mr. King," Rachel, the summit coordinator, finally interrupted. "The panel discussion starts in 5 minutes. "Brandon," he corrected, turning back to Elise. "Please call me Brandon. I'll be watching your presentation in the showcase later. I have a feeling HealthBridge is exactly the kind of innovation we need more of in this industry." As he walked away, Elise felt oddly unsettled. The conversation had been purely professional, focused entirely on technology and social impact, but something about his presence had stirred emotions she thought she'd buried deep. Zoe appeared at her side, eyebrows raised suggestively. "Girl, was that Brandon King himself at our little booth?" And did I see actual human emotions crossing that corporate robot face of his? "Stop it," Elise warned, though she couldn't help smiling. He was just being polite. Besides, I'm not. She twisted the ring on her right hand unconsciously. "I know, honey," Zoe's voice softened, "but Aiden would want you to be happy. You know that, right?" The rest of the day passed in a blur of presentations and networking, but both Brandon and Elise found their thoughts returning to their brief encounter. That evening, when Brandon suggested dinner to discuss potential collaboration, they both pretended it was purely professional interest that made them say yes. Little did they know that this ordinary conference day would set in motion events that would challenge everything they thought they knew about success, love, and the possibility of beginning again. The Chicago Tech Innovation Summit had brought them together, but it was their shared understanding of technology's human side that would forge a connection neither of them was prepared for. Chapter 4. One Night. The Chicago evening painted the city in hues of amber and purple as Brandon and Elise walked out of the conference center together. Her successful presentation at the Emerging Innovators Showcase had led to an invitation to dinner, ostensibly to discuss potential collaboration between TechVant and HealthBridge. But both felt an undercurrent of something more personal beneath the professional premise. "There's this little place in River North," Brandon suggested, his usual certainty softened by an unfamiliar nervousness. "Family-owned Italian restaurant. Away from the usual tech crowd. They make pasta that would convince you heaven exists." Elise hesitated for a moment, her right hand unconsciously touching the ring that now felt heavier than ever. "I should probably call Zoe," she said. "Let her know about the change in plans." "Of course," Brandon nodded, stepping back to give her space. He watched as she made the call, noting how the streetlights caught the subtle highlights in her hair, the way her free hand gestured unconsciously as she spoke. There was an authenticity about her that made his usual world of corporate politics and strategic networking feel artificial in comparison. The restaurant, Bella Notte, was tucked away on a quiet street, its warm light spilling onto the sidewalk through wine-red curtains. The owner, Marco, greeted Brandon by name, a reminder of countless business dinners hosted here, but tonight felt different. Tonight, he wasn't here to close a deal or discuss market strategy. They were seated in a cozy corner booth away from the main dining room. The soft flicker of candlelight created an intimate atmosphere that should have felt presumptuous for a business dinner, but somehow didn't. Elise shed her professional armor slowly, the passion she'd shown for her work during her presentation evolving into more personal conversation. "What made you start HealthBridge?" Brandon asked, genuinely curious. He'd been impressed by her technical expertise, but sensed there was a deeper story behind her mission. Elise took a sip of wine, gathering her thoughts. "I suppose it started with my mother," she began. "She's been an ER nurse in Detroit for 25 years. Growing up, I saw how many people came through those doors feeling lost, overwhelmed by a system that seemed designed to exclude them." She paused, debating whether to continue. "And then, after Aiden," the name hung in the air between them. Brandon leaned forward slightly, his expression encouraging but not pressing. Elise found herself telling him about that tragic wedding night, the words flowing more easily than they had in months. Perhaps it was the wine, or the gentle way he listened, or simply the safety of confiding in someone who existed outside her daily life. "I'm so sorry," Brandon said softly when she finished. His hand moved across the table, almost touching hers before stopping short. "Loss like that, it changes you." "It does," she agreed, meeting his eyes. "But sometimes it also shows you what you're capable of." HealthBridge was born from that understanding, that we all need bridges when we're at our most vulnerable. The conversation flowed naturally from there, moving beyond the professional into more personal territory. Brandon found himself sharing things he rarely discussed: his father's battle with cancer, his mother's withdrawal into grief, the hollow feeling of success without purpose that had been haunting him lately. As they walked along the Chicago River after dinner, the city lights reflecting off the water like scattered stars, something shifted between them. Their shoulders brushed occasionally as they walked, each touch sending ripples of awareness through them both. The night air was cool, but neither suggested calling it a night. "There's a jazz club nearby," Brandon offered. "Live music, great atmosphere, unless you need to get back." Elise knew she should say no. She had meetings early tomorrow, demos to prepare. But the night felt magical, suspended somewhere between reality and dreams. "I'd like that," she heard herself say. The Blue Note was exactly as Brandon had described: intimate, sophisticated, with the smooth sounds of a jazz quartet filling the space. They found a small table near the back, close enough that their knees touched beneath it. The musician's soulful rendition of My Funny Valentine wrapped around them like a velvet cocoon. "Dance with me?" Brandon asked, during a particularly beautiful number. The small dance floor held only a few other couples, swaying gently to the music. Elise hesitated for a heartbeat before taking his offered hand. His touch was warm, confident but gentle as he led her to the floor. They moved together naturally, as if they'd danced 1,000 times before. His hand on the small of her back felt both thrilling and dangerous. "This wasn't what I expected when I came to Chicago," she admitted softly, looking up at him. "What did you expect?" His voice was low, meant only for her. "To pitch my company, to network, to be professional." She gave a small laugh. "Not to be dancing with Brandon King in a jazz club, feeling like what?" he prompted when she trailed off. "Like I'm breaking all my own rules." The music slowed, and with it, their movement. They were barely dancing now, just swaying together in their own private world. Brandon's hand moved slightly on her back, drawing her imperceptibly closer. "Sometimes," he murmured, "the best things in life happen when we break our own rules." The kiss, when it came, felt both inevitable and surprising. It was gentle at first, questioning, giving her every chance to pull away. But Elise found herself responding, her hands sliding up to his shoulders as his arms tightened around her waist. They broke apart slowly, both slightly breathless. The music had changed, but neither had noticed. Reality began to seep back in around the edges of their bubble, the other couples on the dance floor, the watching eyes, the complications of their respective lives. "I should get you back to your hotel," Brandon said softly, though everything in him wanted to prolong this night forever. The ride in his car was quiet, charged with unspoken possibilities. When they arrived at her hotel, he walked her to the elevator, both of them aware of the choice hanging in the air between them. "Brandon," Elise began, her voice uncertain. He touched her face gently, his thumb tracing her cheekbone. "We don't have to decide anything tonight," he said. "This can be just what it is, one perfect Chicago evening." But as their eyes met, they both knew it was already more than that. When Elise reached up to kiss him again, it held none of the hesitation of their first kiss. His arms went around her immediately, pulling her close as the elevator doors closed behind them. The night that followed was a revelation for them both, tender, passionate, and tinged with the bitter sweetness of knowing it couldn't last. In the darkness of her hotel room, they found a connection that transcended physical attraction, something that spoke to the lonely places in both their souls. As dawn began to paint the Chicago skyline in shades of pink and gold, they lay tangled in the sheets, neither wanting to acknowledge the approaching reality of day. Elise's head rested on Brandon's chest, his fingers trailing lazily through her hair. "What happens now?" she asked softly, not sure she wanted to hear the answer. Brandon's arms tightened around her slightly. "Now," he said, "we face the morning, and then We see what's possible. They both knew it wouldn't be simple. Their lives were in different cities, their worlds barely intersecting. But something had started in Chicago, something neither of them had been looking for, but now couldn't imagine walking away from. As the sun rose over Lake Michigan, casting long shadows across the rumpled sheets, Brandon and Elise held onto their moment of perfect understanding, knowing that soon they would have to step back into the real world and face whatever consequences awaited them there. Chapter 5. Corporate Whispers. The San Francisco morning fog hadn't yet lifted when Brandon strode into TechVant's headquarters, his mind still half in Chicago. The memory of Elise in his arms, their shared vulnerability and connection, felt almost dreamlike against the stark corporate reality of his 40-story tower. 2 weeks had passed since that transformative night, and now Healthbridge Solutions was officially in partnership talks with TechVant, a decision that made perfect business sense but carried far more personal weight than anyone in the boardroom could have guessed. Skylar Reed stood at her office window, watching Brandon's arrival through the glass walls that separated the executive floor's power players. She'd spent 8 years methodically climbing TechVant's corporate ladder, transforming herself from a promising young MBA graduate into the company's most influential COO. Every career move had been calculated, every alliance carefully cultivated. She'd been there through the company's explosive growth, had helped shape its evolution from scrappy startup to tech giant. The CEO position should have been her natural progression. But something had changed in Brandon since Chicago. She'd seen it first in the all-hands meeting where he'd announced the healthcare initiative Refocus. The way he talked about technology serving humanity and returning to our roots. It wasn't the Brandon King she'd grown to understand and anticipate. The Detroit team arrives tomorrow, Parker reminded Brandon as he settled into his office. Miss Perry's flight lands at 10 a.m. Would you like me to arrange the usual car service? Yes, thank you, Parker. Brandon tried to keep his voice neutral, professional, but Skylar, approaching his office, caught the slight softening in his tone. She'd built her career on reading people, on understanding the subtle shifts that signaled vulnerability or advantage. We need to discuss the Healthbridge integration, she announced, entering without knocking, a power move she'd earned through years of proven loyalty. There are concerns that need to be addressed. Brandon looked up from his laptop, noting the tension in her perfectly maintained posture. 8 years of working together had taught him to read her moods, but lately something had shifted in their dynamic. What concerns Skylar? She placed a folder on his desk with precise movements. A startup less than 2 years old, run by someone barely out of college, with technology that hasn't been properly vetted by our team. The speed of this partnership approval feels unprecedented. Their technology is solid, Brandon countered, remembering the long hours he and Elise had spent discussing Healthbridge's architecture. The memory of her passion, her brilliant mind at work, threatened to soften his professional demeanor. Solid enough to fast-track due diligence, Skylar pressed. She reached into her folder, pulling out another document. I've been reviewing the Chicago conference records. You spent considerable time with Ms. Perry outside of official events. The accusation hung in the air between them. Brandon kept his expression carefully neutral, though his pulse quickened. I don't appreciate what you're implying, Skylar. Healthbridge's mission aligns perfectly with TechVant's original healthcare focus, something you've been pushing us to return to for months. Don't turn this around on me. Skylar's perfectly manicured nails drummed once on his desk. I've dedicated 8 years to this company. I was here when we were working out of that garage in Palo Alto. I helped build our Asian market strategy, secured our Series B funding, managed 3 major acquisitions. I won't stand by and watch you risk everything because you're infatuated with some girl from Detroit. The word girl carried all the dismissiveness Skylar could muster. Brandon's jaw tightened. That's enough. His voice carried the steel that had made him a formidable CEO. Healthbridge is a legitimate partnership opportunity, and Ms. Perry is a talented innovator. I suggest you focus on making this integration successful rather than looking for problems that don't exist. Skylar stood, smoothing her already immaculate suit. As COO, it's my job to protect this company, even from its own CEO if necessary. I hope you remember that. After she left, Brandon sat back in his chair, tension headache building behind his eyes. He knew Skylar well enough to recognize the threat beneath her words. She wouldn't let this go. She'd dig and probe until she found something she could use. Throughout the day, whispers spread through the office like smoke through air vents. Junior employees who'd been at the Chicago conference shared snippets of gossip about the CEO's apparent interest in the founder of their newest partnership company. Middle managers speculated about the sudden rush to integrate a relatively unknown startup. And through it all, Skylar moved like a shark through waters she'd long considered her territory. Her network within TechVant was extensive and loyal. She'd mentored half the senior engineers, had championed key promotions, had cultivated relationships at every level of the company. Now, those connections became intelligence channels, feeding her information about every aspect of the Healthbridge partnership and Brandon's involvement. By late afternoon, Brandon's executive assistant had picked up enough office chatter to feel concerned. "Sir," Parker ventured, bringing in another stack of partnership documents, "there's been some talk." "I know, Parker," Brandon sighed, running a hand through his hair. "How bad is it?" "Ms. Reed has been in meetings with the compliance team all afternoon, and I overheard something about expedited background checks." Brandon's stomach tightened. Background checks meant they'd dig into everything, including Elise's past, her marriage, her loss. Things she'd trusted him with on that intimate Chicago night would become corporate ammunition. He picked up his phone to call James Chen, his mentor and most trusted board member. The older man's wisdom had guided him through countless challenges, but this felt different, more personal. "You've stirred up quite a hornet's nest," James said when he answered, skipping pleasantries. "Skylar's been calling board members all day with concerns about the Healthbridge deal." "The deal is solid, James. You've seen the numbers, the technology. This isn't about numbers, son, and we both know it." James's voice carried years of experience navigating corporate politics. "What's really going on with you and this girl?" Brandon stood, moving to the windows where the fog had finally burned away to reveal the bay beyond. "It's complicated," he admitted, "but I swear, James, my interest in Healthbridge is purely professional. The personal, that's separate." "Nothing's ever separate at this level, Brandon. You know that." There was a pause on the line. "Be careful. Skylar's not going to let this go, and she's got allies on the board who still think she should have your job." After hanging up, Brandon spent hours reviewing the partnership documents, looking for any weakness Skylar might exploit. The sun had set by the time Parker knocked again, this time with a different kind of warning. "Sir, Ms. Reed's team has been accessing the Chicago conference records, security footage, hotel reservations, everything, and—" Parker hesitated. "They've been in touch with someone in Detroit, someone who knows Ms. Perry." Brandon's blood ran cold. He knew how this game was played. He'd been in corporate America long enough to recognize the signs of a calculated takedown. Skylar would build her case methodically, gathering evidence of impropriety, real or manufactured, until she had enough to force his hand. His phone lit up with another text from Ellis. "Just had the strangest call from an old acquaintance asking about Chicago. Everything okay?" Before he could respond, an email from Skylar landed in his inbox, copied to the entire board. "Urgent concerns regarding Healthbridge partnership. Confidential report attached." Brandon's finger hovered over the attachment, his mind racing. Opening it would make this real. would start a chain of events he might not be able to control, but not opening it would show weakness, give Skylar more ammunition. The document loaded slowly, each page a carefully constructed argument against the partnership. Market analysis, risk assessments, and buried in the middle, a section titled Leadership Concerns that made his heart stop. There, in clinical corporate language, Skylar had laid out every interaction between him and Elise at the Chicago conference. Security footage, timestamps of their dinner, their walk, their return to the hotel, credit card receipts, witness statements from conference staff, and more damaging. Background information on Elise's, her marriage to Aidan, his tragic death, all presented in a way that cast doubt on her stability and judgment. The report even suggested that her relationship with Brandon might be a calculated move to secure the partnership. His phone rang. James again. Emergency board meeting tomorrow morning, before the Detroit team arrives. Brandon, you need to get ahead of this. The office had emptied hours ago, but Brandon remained at his desk, the city lights below twinkling like distant stars. Everything he'd built, everything he believed in was suddenly at risk. But more importantly, the woman he was falling in love with was about to walk into a corporate war zone. He pulled up his email, fingers hovering over the keyboard. He needed to warn her, to explain, but any communication between them now would only add fuel to Skylar's fire. In the darkness of his office, Brandon King faced the hardest decision of his career: protect his company or protect his heart. And somewhere over America, in a plane bound for San Francisco, Elise Perry slept peacefully, unaware that her dreams of both love and professional success were about to collide in spectacular fashion. Chapter 6. The Fall. The TechVant boardroom felt like a courtroom the morning of the emergency meeting, its glass walls reflecting the San Francisco dawn in shades of accusation. Brandon arrived first, the weight of the impending confrontation settling on his shoulders as he reviewed Skylar's damning report one final time. Board members filed in slowly, their expressions ranging from concern to barely concealed judgment. Each carried tablets loaded with Skylar's carefully crafted narrative. James Chen was the last to arrive, giving Brandon a slight nod that carried both warning and sympathy. Given the urgency of the situation, Skylar began, standing to address the room with practiced precision, I appreciate the board meeting on such short notice. As my report details, there are serious concerns about the proposed HealthBridge partnership that require immediate attention. Patricia Morrison, the longest-serving board member, leaned forward. These financial projections are concerning. The former CFO of a major healthcare company, her opinion carried significant weight. The risk assessment suggests, with respect, Brandon interrupted, those projections are based on incomplete data. If you look at the full market analysis, I believe, Skylar cut in smoothly, the more pressing concern is the unusual circumstances surrounding this partnership. She activated the room's displays, bringing up security footage from Chicago. The speed with which this deal has been pursued raises questions about objectivity and proper due diligence. The room's atmosphere shifted as images of Brandon and Elise appeared on screen, their dinner, their walk by the river, their return to the hotel. Each frame twisted what had been genuine connection into something that looked calculating and suspicious. Before Brandon could respond, Parker appeared at the door. Ms. Perry and her team have arrived. The timing couldn't have been worse. Brandon felt the weight of the board's collective gaze, measuring his reaction. Through years of practiced control, he kept his expression neutral, but inside, his thoughts were chaos. Perhaps, Skylar suggested with deadly precision, this would be an excellent opportunity to address these concerns directly. It was a trap, and Brandon knew it, but refusing would only confirm the board's suspicions. He nodded to Parker, and the minutes that followed felt like hours as they waited for Elise to arrive. She entered with quiet dignity, her deep blue suit a stark contrast to the boardroom's sterile grey. Brandon watched her eyes take in the scene, the displayed photos, the tense faces, the way Skylar stood like a prosecutor ready to deliver closing arguments. For a moment, their gazes met, and he saw trust there that made what was about to happen even more devastating. "Ms. Perry," Skylar took control before Brandon could speak, "thank you for joining us. We were just discussing some concerns about the proposed partnership." What followed was a masterclass in corporate evisceration. Skylar led the board through a series of increasingly pointed questions about Healthbridge's business model, technology platform, and market strategy. Elise handled each query with grace and intelligence, but Brandon could see Skylar building to something more devastating. "Ms. Perry," Skylar finally said, her tone deceptively gentle, "could you tell us about your relationship with Mr. King?" The room went absolutely still. Elise's composure flickered for just a moment before she answered carefully, "Mr. King has been incredibly supportive of Healthbridge's mission. Our relationship is purely professional." "Really?" Skylar's smile was predatory as she brought up more security footage. "These images suggest otherwise, and given your history of emotional instability following your husband's death—" "How dare you?" Elise's voice was quiet but fierce. The mention of Aiden hit her like a physical blow, but she maintained her dignity. "You have no right to—" "The board has every right to protect this company's interests," Skylar cut in. "Especially when our CEO appears to be compromised by personal involvement with someone whose tragic past might be affecting their judgment." Brandon felt the moment slipping away from him. The board was watching, waiting to see how he would handle this crisis. His entire career, everything he'd built, hung in the balance. And in that moment of pressure, he made a mistake that would haunt him forever. "The board's concerns are valid," he heard himself say, his voice professional and distant. "Perhaps we need to reevaluate the timeline of this partnership and ensure proper due diligence is conducted." The betrayal in Elise's eyes was absolute. She stared at him as if seeing him for the first time, all the warmth and trust draining away to be replaced by something cold and final. In that moment, Brandon saw everything they'd built crumbling, not just the partnership, but the deeper connection they'd forged in Chicago, the understanding that had grown between them, the possibility of love after loss. "I see," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Each word carried the weight of shattered trust. "Thank you for clarifying your position, Mr. King." She stood, gathering her dignity around her like armor. "I believe I have all the information I need about Techvant's values and leadership." She walked out with her head high, but Brandon saw the slight trembling of her hands, the tears she was fighting back. He wanted to run after her, to explain, to take back his moment of cowardice, but he remained frozen in his chair as she disappeared. The board meeting continued, discussions of risk mitigation and public relations strategies washing over him like white noise. He'd protected his company, maintained his position, but the cost was devastating. In trying to save everything, he'd lost the one thing that had made it all feel worthwhile again. Hours later, alone in his office, Brandon stared at his phone. Elise's number glowed on the screen, but he knew she wouldn't answer. She'd left the building immediately after the meeting, catching the first flight back to Detroit. His messages went unread, his calls unanswered. The city lights blurred as he looked out his window, the weight of his mistake settling around him like a heavy cloak. He'd chosen his corporate mask over his heart, and in doing so had become exactly what he'd been fighting not to be, another soulless executive who'd forgotten what really mattered. Somewhere over America, Ellie sat in a plane bound for Detroit, her tears finally falling freely as she twisted the ring on her right hand. She'd lost Aidan to tragedy, but this pain was different. The sharp sting of betrayal, of watching someone choose ambition over love, of seeing trust shattered in a single moment of weakness. Neither of them knew it yet, but this wasn't the end of their story. Sometimes the greatest falls lead to the most important revelations, and the hardest lessons teach us who we really are. But for now, they were both lost in their private pain, wondering how something that had felt so right could go so terribly wrong. Chapter 7. Truth and Consequences. The Techvant office felt like a mausoleum in the days following Elise's departure. Brandon moved through the spaces like a ghost, his footsteps echoing in hallways that seemed colder, emptier since she'd walked out of that boardroom. The triumph Skylar had orchestrated left a bitter taste that no amount of corporate success could wash away. He'd replayed the moment 1,000 times in his mind, Elise's face as he'd chosen corporate safety over truth, the light in her eyes dying as he'd betrayed not just their personal connection, but every principle they'd discussed that night in Chicago. The memory haunted him, made more acute by her complete silence. No response to his calls, his messages, his desperate attempts to explain. On the third day, James Chen appeared in his doorway, his normally cheerful expression replaced by grave concern. "You look like hell, son." Brandon didn't bother denying it. The sleepless nights were evident in the shadows. Under his eyes, his usually impeccable appearance showing signs of strain. "I made a mistake, James." "Yes, you did." The older man settled into a chair, studying him with the wisdom of decades in corporate leadership. "But not the one you think. The board is satisfied, the stock price is stable, and Skylar is practically glowing with triumph. By corporate standards, you handled it perfectly. Then why does it feel like I've destroyed something irreplaceable?" Before James could respond, Parker appeared with an unusual urgency in his typically composed demeanor. "Sir, there's something you need to see." He placed a thick folder on Brandon's desk. The compliance team just forwarded their complete background report on Healthbridge and Ms. Perry. This isn't what Ms. Reed presented to the board." Brandon's hands trembled slightly as he opened the folder. The first page was a police report, dated exactly 1 year and 8 months ago. The clinical language did nothing to soften the impact of the tragedy it described. At approximately 11:42 p.m., a vehicular collision occurred at the intersection of Woodward Avenue and Warren Street. Vehicle 1, operated by an intoxicated driver, BAC.21, ran a red light at high speed, striking the driver's side of Vehicle 2. The driver of Vehicle 2, Aidan Thompson, 23, was pronounced dead at the scene. His passenger, Elise Thompson, née Perry, 22, sustained minor injuries but was determined to be in stable condition. Both victims were wearing formal attire, having departed from their wedding reception at Hartford Memorial Baptist Church approximately 20 minutes prior to the incident. Brandon's vision blurred as he read further. The report included witness statements describing how Elise had to be physically restrained from trying to reach Aidan, how she kept repeating, "We were almost there," through her tears, referring, he would later learn, to the Detroit Marriott, where they'd planned to spend their wedding night. "There's more," Parker said quietly, his voice uncharacteristically gentle. "About Ms. Reed's investigation and the report she presented to the board." The next section revealed the extent of Skylar's manipulation. She had deliberately twisted information, presented partial truths, and even pressured some employees to emphasize certain aspects of what they'd observed in Chicago. The narrative she'd crafted about Elise being emotionally unstable was a complete fabrication. "Get me James Chen. Now." Brandon's voice was raw with emotion. While Parker hurried to make the call, Brandon pulled up his email, finding the message he'd been dreading to read. Elise's official withdrawal of HealthBridge from partnership consideration with TechVant. Her words were professional, precise, and completely devoid of the warmth that had characterized their earlier interactions. James arrived just as Brandon was finishing a call with his personal attorney. One look at Brandon's face told him everything he needed to know. "You found something." Skylar manipulated everything. Brandon's voice was tight with controlled anger. The report she presented to the board was deliberately misleading. She used Elise's personal tragedy to create doubts about her character, her company, and her intentions. "And you played right into it," James observed without judgment, "because it was easier to believe the worst than to stand up and fight for what you knew was right." The truth of those words hit Brandon like a physical blow. He had failed not just Elise, but himself. In trying to protect his position, he'd betrayed everything he claimed to believe in. Through Parker's careful research, they found a contact for Zoe Williams, Elise's best friend, who had been a bridesmaid at the wedding. Getting her to talk to him proved challenging, but Brandon's genuine remorse must have come through in his voice. "You've got some nerve calling me after what you did to Elise," Zoe snapped when she finally answered. "I know," Brandon admitted. "I handled everything wrong, but I need to understand. I need to know the whole story." Perhaps it was the genuine remorse in his voice, or maybe Zoe saw an opportunity to help her friend heal, but gradually she began to talk. The story she told brought tears to Brandon's eyes. "They were high school sweethearts," Zoe explained, her voice carrying years of shared history. "Elise was this brilliant computer science prodigy, and Aiden was the popular guy who everyone thought would just coast through life on his charm. But he saw something in her that nobody else did back then. He'd sit for hours listening to her talk about coding and healthcare accessibility, totally fascinated. The picture Zoe painted was of a love story that had seemed destined for a fairy tale ending. Aiden had worked 3 jobs to help put himself through college, while Elise earned her scholarship to the University of Michigan. They'd waited to be intimate, wanting their wedding night to be perfect. The presidential suite at the Detroit Marriott, Zoe's voice caught slightly. Aiden had saved for months to book it. He wanted everything to be perfect for their first time together. The revelation hit Brandon like a thunderbolt. Elise had been a virgin when she married Aiden. Their wedding night would have been their first time together, a moment of sacred trust that was brutally stolen by a drunk driver's recklessness. "She never—" Brandon couldn't finish the sentence. "No," Zoe confirmed softly. "You were her first in Chicago. Do you understand now why what happened in that boardroom destroyed her? She had finally opened her heart again, trusted someone again, and you—" "I failed her," Brandon whispered. The weight of his betrayal felt crushing now. That night in Chicago had meant so much more than he'd realized. Elise hadn't just shared her body with him. She'd given him her trust, her vulnerability, her first step toward healing. The conversation with Zoe lasted hours, revealing layers of truth that made Brandon's heart ache. How Elise had channeled her grief into creating something meaningful, how she'd kept her wedding ring, moving it to her right hand as a symbol not just of loss, but of enduring love and promise. As night fell over San Francisco, Brandon stood at his office window, looking out at a city that suddenly felt foreign. His phone buzzed with a message from Skylar. "Board wants to discuss Asian market expansion tomorrow." Breakfast meeting? The sight of her name made his jaw clench. Tomorrow would bring its own battles, confronting Skylar, addressing the board, setting right the professional wrongs he'd allowed to happen. But tonight, his thoughts were entirely focused on a more personal mission. He pulled up his laptop, booking a flight to Detroit. The corporate warfare could wait. First, he needed to find Elise, to beg her forgiveness, to prove that he could be worthy of the trust he'd so carelessly broken. What he didn't know was that earning back Elise's trust would require more than just apologies and explanations. It would demand a complete reassessment of who he was and what he truly valued. The journey ahead would either break him completely or forge him into the man he was always meant to be. The truth had found him at last. What he did with it would determine not just his future, but the possibility of healing two hearts shattered by very different kinds of loss. Chapter 8. The Search. Detroit in autumn was a city of contrasts that challenged everything Brandon thought he knew about urban renewal and community resilience. His private jet landed at Detroit Metropolitan Wayne County Airport on a crisp October morning, the trees along the highway blazing with fall colors that seemed to mock his somber mood. The past months had transformed him from TechVant's untouchable CEO into something else entirely. Back in San Francisco, he'd confronted Skylar with evidence of her manipulation, leading to her resignation, though resigned with full benefits was a gentler fate than she deserved. The board had been appropriately contrite when presented with the full truth, but their apologies meant nothing without Elise's forgiveness. Brandon chose the Detroit Foundation Hotel as his base, its historical architecture a testament to the city's ability to reinvent itself. The former fire headquarters had been transformed into a luxury hotel while preserving its soul, a metaphor he didn't miss. Each morning, he walked through downtown, learning the city's rhythms, trying to see it through Elise's eyes. His first act was establishing the Detroit Tech Innovation Fund, a $50 million initiative to support local startups. But unlike typical Silicon Valley investment funds, this one came with a difference. Community advisory boards would help direct the funding, ensuring it served real needs rather than just chasing returns. "You're doing something interesting here," observed Dr. Marcus Thompson, a community leader who'd initially viewed Brandon with skepticism. They were touring a neighborhood health clinic that could benefit from HealthBridge-style technology. "Most tech people come here thinking they know all the answers. You're actually listening." "I learned that lesson the hard way," Brandon admitted, watching elderly patients struggle with existing healthcare apps. Technology without community input is just expensive noise. He attended tech meetups in renovated warehouses where young developers talked passionately about solving local problems. He visited startup incubators housed in former auto plants where innovation grew from industrial roots. Each interaction taught him something about the city Elise loved, about the community that had shaped her vision. "She won't see you," Zoe warned during one of their increasingly frequent phone calls. "She's buried herself in work, launching HealthBridge's pilot program in 3 community health centers." "I'm not asking her to," Brandon replied, reviewing plans for a coding education program in Detroit public schools. "I'm trying to understand, really understand, what she's been trying to build here." His education came in unexpected moments, like when Ms. Rose, an elderly woman at a community center, spent an hour showing him why HealthBridge's interface worked better for her arthritic hands than other medical apps. Or when teenage students at a tech workshop taught him their perspectives on accessible technology. "You're different than I expected," said Jason, a young coder at a hackathon Brandon was judging. "On the news, you seemed like just another tech bro billionaire." Brandon had laughed at that. "A month in Detroit will change anyone's perspective. This city, it teaches you what really matters." The local tech community, initially skeptical of the Silicon Valley CEO, gradually warmed to his genuine interest and commitment. The Innovation Fund wasn't just writing checks, it was creating real opportunities, mentorship programs, and partnerships with local universities. "You're doing good work here," James Chen told him during one of their daily calls. But are you sure this isn't just an elaborate way to avoid dealing with tech-vance issues? The company's fine, Brandon replied, staring out at the Detroit River from his hotel room. The new COO is implementing the healthcare initiative reforms we discussed. This is more important. 1 month into his Detroit sojourn, breakthrough came from an unexpected source. He was visiting a youth coding program his fund had sponsored when one of the instructors mentioned a healthcare technology workshop at a local startup incubator. "Yeah, there's this brilliant woman running it," the young teacher said. "She's developed this amazing platform for healthcare access, keeps to herself mostly, but her work is incredible." Brandon's heart raced. This incubator, where is it? The Techtown Detroit building was a renovated factory in the city's new center area, its industrial chic design housing dozens of startups and innovation programs. Brandon's hands were unusually unsteady as he parked his rental car in the lot. The security guard recognized him. The Detroit Tech Innovation Fund's logo was prominently displayed in the lobby, but Brandon asked him to keep his presence quiet. He made his way to the 3rd floor, where the healthcare technology workshop was scheduled. Through the glass walls of a conference room, he saw her. Elise was standing at a whiteboard, explaining something to a group of attentive students. Her natural hair was styled differently now, and she wore a simple blazer over jeans, but her presence was magnetic as ever. Even from a distance, he could see the passion in her gestures as she talked about healthcare accessibility. Brandon stood in the shadows of the hallway, not wanting to disturb the class. He watched as she answered questions, encouraged discussion, and shared her vision for technology that could make a real difference in people's lives. This was her element, not the artificial world of corporate boardrooms, but here, doing work that mattered. The workshop ran late, students lingering to ask questions and share ideas. Brandon waited patiently, rehearsing words he'd practiced 1,000 times, but when the last student finally left and Elise looked up to find him standing in the doorway, all his carefully prepared speeches evaporated. She froze for a moment, her expression unreadable. Then, deliberately, she began gathering her materials into her bag. "Elise," he started, his voice rougher than he intended. "Please, just give me 5 minutes. I think you said everything that needed saying in that boardroom," she replied, her voice carefully neutral. She moved toward the door, but he remained in the doorway. "I was wrong," he said simply, "about everything, and I've spent every day since then trying to figure out how to make it right." "There's nothing to make right, Mr. King." The formal address was like a knife to his heart. "You showed me exactly who you are and what you value. Message received." "No." He stepped into the room, careful to maintain distance between them. "I showed you who I was afraid of becoming, who I almost let myself become, but that's not who I am, not who I want to be." She paused, and for a moment he saw a flicker of something in her eyes, pain perhaps, or memory. "What do you want from me, Brandon?" "A chance," he said softly. "Not to explain or excuse what I did, but to show you who I really am, to prove that I can be worthy of the trust I broke." "Trust isn't something you earn back with grand gestures or pretty words," she replied, but he noted she hadn't walked away yet. "I know. That's why I'm here in Detroit, not just passing through, not just for show. I'm here to understand your world, your work, your dreams, the city and community you love so much." He gestured to the whiteboard, where her workshop notes still gleamed. "The difference you're trying to make." Elise studied him for a long moment, her expression thoughtful. "I've heard about the Innovation Fund," she admitted. "The coding programs, the community initiatives. Zoe says you're trying to do good here." "I'm trying to be better," he corrected gently. "The man you met in Chicago, the one who saw beyond corporate success to what really matters, that's who I want to be. who I should have been in that boardroom. She picked up her bag, finally moving toward the door. As she passed him, she paused. "The workshop runs every Tuesday and Thursday," she said quietly, "if you're really interested in healthcare accessibility in underserved communities." It wasn't forgiveness, wasn't even close to the reconciliation he hoped for, but it was a tiny crack in the wall between them, a small chance to prove himself through actions rather than words. "Thank you," he said softly, but she was already walking away, her footsteps echoing down the hallway. Brandon stayed in the empty conference room for a long time, looking at the notes she'd left on the whiteboard, diagrams of healthcare systems, user interface sketches, community feedback loops. In every line and arrow, he could see her dedication to making a real difference in people's lives. He pulled out his phone, canceling his return flight to San Francisco. The message to his executive team was brief: extending stay in Detroit indefinitely. Continue with healthcare initiative as planned. His transformation, he realized, was just beginning. The lessons Detroit had taught him about community, resilience, and genuine innovation were reshaping not just his approach to business, but his understanding of what truly mattered in life. The path to earning back Elise's trust would be long, but for the first time since that devastating day in the boardroom, he felt hope. Not because she'd offered forgiveness, but because she'd offered something more valuable, an opportunity to show, through dedicated action over time, that people could change, that trust could be rebuilt, that second chances were possible for those willing to earn them. Chapter 9. Winter's Thaw. Detroit's winter descended like a slow curtain, transforming the industrial cityscape into a crystalline wonderland. On a snowy December morning, Brandon arrived early at Techtown, brushing ice crystals from his wool coat. The building's renovated industrial space had become both sanctuary and torture chamber over the past month. A place where he could be near Elise, but couldn't bridge the careful distance she maintained. Today's healthcare technology workshop focused on designing interfaces for elderly patients with limited tech experience. Brandon took his usual spot at the back of the room, notebook ready. For 4 weeks, he'd attended every session, absorbing not just the technical content, but the way Elise approached problems with both brilliance and empathy. "Remember," Elise was saying, her voice carrying that passionate conviction he remembered from Chicago, "every design choice we make either invites people in or shuts them out. When we're building healthcare interfaces, we're not just creating software, we're creating lifelines." She moved with natural grace at the whiteboard, drawing user flow diagrams while explaining the importance of accessibility. Her natural hair was styled differently now, and her professional attire couldn't hide the subtle tension in her shoulders whenever she sensed his gaze. But there were moments, brief flashes, when she forgot to maintain her walls, when her true self shone through with all the brilliance that had first captivated him. "Mr. King," she called unexpectedly, making him start. It was the first time she'd directly addressed him in a workshop. "You've implemented healthcare systems at scale. What challenges did you encounter with user adoption in older populations?" The room's attention shifted to him, but Brandon felt only the weight of her direct gaze. He stood, moving to the front of the room with careful confidence. "Our biggest mistake was assuming technical literacy. We built elegant solutions that looked great in boardroom presentations, but failed in real-world applications." "And how did you address that failure?" Her question carried layers of meaning that had nothing to do with software. "We had to start over," he admitted. "Learn to listen to the actual users, understand their fears and needs, build trust before trying to implement solutions." He held her gaze. "Sometimes the hardest lesson is learning that expertise without empathy is worthless." Something flickered in her eyes, recognition perhaps, or memory. For a moment, they were back in that Chicago restaurant, sharing dreams about technology that could change lives. Then she turned, back to the class, the moment broken but not forgotten. After the workshop, as students filed out into the snowy evening, Brandon remained behind. It had become his unofficial role to help clean the whiteboards, a small act of service that felt like penance and hope combined. "You've been taking detailed notes," Elise observed suddenly, breaking their usual silence. She nodded toward his notebook. "Pretty comprehensive for someone who runs a billion-dollar tech company." "I'm learning more here than in any corporate strategy meeting," he replied honestly. "Your approach to user-centered design, it's revolutionary, the way you consider the whole community ecosystem, not just individual users." "That's what I was trying to explain in the boardroom that day," she said quietly. "Before..." The unfinished sentence hung between them like frost in the air. Brandon set down his eraser, turning to face her fully. "I know. I should have listened then. I'm listening now." She moved to the window, watching snow fall over the city she loved. "Why are you really here, Brandon? And don't say it's for the workshops." "I'm here because this is where the real work is happening," he answered, joining her but maintaining a respectful distance. "Not in Silicon Valley boardrooms or venture capital meetings, but here, in communities that need technology to serve people, not shareholders. And that's worth abandoning your California empire." "I haven't abandoned anything," he corrected gently. "I'm rebuilding it. Just differently. The healthcare initiative we discussed in Chicago, it's happening, but this time we're doing it right. Working with communities, understanding their needs, creating solutions that actually serve people." For the first time in months, he saw a flicker of real interest in her expression. "I've heard about the changes at TechVant, the new community health partnerships, the focus on accessibility." "All inspired by you," Brandon admitted. "By what you've built here, by what you've been teaching in these workshops. I meant what I said about learning." Over the next few weeks, subtle changes began to emerge in their interactions. During workshops, Ellie started occasionally calling on him for input, particularly when discussions turned to scaling community solutions. Her students, many of whom recognized him from local tech news coverage of the Innovation Fund, began seeking his advice after class. More significantly, she stopped leaving immediately after workshops. Their conversations, though still primarily focused on technology and community impact, began to carry echoes of the easy rapport they'd shared in Chicago. One evening, after a particularly intensive workshop on healthcare data security, Brandon made a suggestion about implementing privacy protocols that made Elise pause. "That's actually brilliant," she admitted, almost reluctantly. "It would solve the compliance issues while maintaining accessibility." "I had a good teacher," he replied softly. Their eyes met across the whiteboard, and for a moment, the walls between them seemed to thin. Then a student interrupted with a question, and the moment passed. But something had shifted. The Detroit winter deepened, turning the city into a monochrome painting of whites and grays. But inside Techtown, something was beginning to thaw. It wasn't dramatic or sudden, but rather a slow melting of barriers, a gradual rebuilding of trust through consistent actions and shared purpose. Brandon learned to read the subtle signs of progress, the way Elise no longer tensed when he entered a room, how she'd sometimes forget herself and smile at his comments, the gradual lengthening of their post-workshop conversations. Each small change felt like a victory, a step toward redemption. One particularly cold evening, as they worked late reviewing student projects, Elise made a quiet confession. "I was wrong about one thing," she said, not looking up from her papers. "Oh." Brandon kept his voice carefully neutral. "That day in the boardroom, I thought it showed me who you really were." She finally met his eyes. but maybe it just showed who you were afraid of becoming. The words hung between them like a bridge beginning to form over troubled waters. Brandon wanted to reach for her hand, to pull her close, and promise he'd never be that man again. Instead, he simply nodded, understanding that trust rebuilt must be stronger than trust initially given. The workshop on Thursday is about integrating community feedback into system design, she said, gathering her things. Don't be late. As she left, Brandon remained at the window, watching her walk through the snowy night to her car. The city lights reflected off the fresh snow, creating halos of possibility in the darkness. He pulled out his notebook, filled now with weeks of observations, ideas, and growing understanding of what really mattered in both technology and life. Tomorrow would bring another workshop, another chance to prove through actions rather than words that he had changed, that he understood now what she'd been trying to teach him all along. That true innovation comes from serving others, that real strength lies in vulnerability, that love means choosing someone's truth over your own comfort. The Detroit winter had taught him patience, had shown him that some things can't be rushed or forced. Like the city itself, rebuilding required time, dedication, and an unwavering commitment to doing things right this time. What he didn't know yet was that all these moments, the workshops, the late-night conversations, the gradual rebuilding of trust, were leading to something bigger than either of them had imagined. But for now, he was content to take it one day at a time, one small victory at a time, one thawed layer at a time. Chapter 10. The Letter. The Detroit winter had settled into a rhythm of steel-grey skies and swirling snow when Brandon finally sat down to write the letter he'd been composing in his heart for 2 months. His suite at the Foundation Hotel had become a kind of sanctuary, its vintage architectural details and view of downtown providing the perfect backdrop for deep reflection. The past 2 months had been transformative. Through the workshops, health fairs, and community events, he'd watched Elise gradually lower her defenses, allowing him to demonstrate through consistent action that his change was genuine. Their professional collaboration had begun to rekindle shadows of their former connection. But Brandon knew that something more was needed, a complete and honest laying bare of his heart. He'd discarded a dozen drafts already, each attempt feeling too formal or too desperate. Finally, as midnight approached and the city lights twinkled through falling snow, he began to write from the deepest place of truth he could find. Dear Elise, I've written this letter 100 times in my mind, but words always feel inadequate when trying to express the depth of regret, understanding, and hope that fill my heart. Still, you deserve the truth, all of it, so I'll try to give you that here. That day in the boardroom, I didn't just fail you professionally. I failed the promise I saw in your eyes that night in Chicago, the trust you placed in me when you shared your story, your dreams, your heart. I failed myself by choosing corporate safety over human dignity. The man you met in Chicago, the one who talked about technology serving humanity, about making real differences in people's lives, that was the real me, before I let fear and ambition blur my vision. These months in Detroit have taught me more than just the importance of community-focused development or accessible healthcare solutions. They've taught me about courage, your courage in rebuilding your life after unimaginable loss, in channeling grief into purpose, in daring to open your heart again despite the risk of pain. I understand now what I couldn't see then. When you shared the story of Aiden, of that tragic wedding night, you weren't just telling me about your past, you were trusting me with your most vulnerable truth. And in that boardroom, I didn't just damage a business relationship or a potential romance. I shattered a trust that you had carefully, bravely chosen to extend. Learning about your journey How you transformed loss into mission, pain into purpose, has changed how I see everything. The work you're doing with HealthBridge isn't just innovative technology. It's a testament to the power of human resilience and the importance of serving others. You've built something beautiful from heartbreak, something that will help countless people navigate their own difficult moments. These past months, watching you teach and lead, seeing your passion for making technology truly serve human needs, has shown me what real success looks like. It's not measured in stock prices or board approval, but in lives touched, communities served, barriers broken down. I've learned that real change isn't about grand gestures or dramatic moments. It's about showing up day after day, doing the work that matters. It's about listening more than speaking, understanding before acting, serving before leading. You've taught me this through your example, through the way you approach every challenge with both brilliance and humanity. The Innovation Fund, the community initiatives, they weren't attempts to win you back. They were my way of learning to be the person I should have been all along, the person who understands that true leadership is about service, that real innovation must be grounded in human needs and experiences. I know now that trust, once broken, can't be demanded back. It must be rebuilt slowly, through consistent actions and unwavering commitment to truth. These months of attending your workshops, of learning from you and your community, have been about more than professional development. They've been about becoming someone worthy of trust again, not just yours, but my own. The man who stood silent in that boardroom while Skylar twisted your story. He's gone. In his place is someone who understands that real strength lies not in maintaining corporate facades, but in standing up for what's right, in protecting the trust others place in us, in choosing humanity over expediency. I'm not asking for forgiveness. What I'm asking for is a chance, not to return to what we had in Chicago, but to build something new, something based on who we both are now, on what we've learned, on the understanding that love isn't just about romantic moments or perfect connections. It's about choosing each other every day, about supporting each other's missions, about building something meaningful together. Your work is changing lives. Your vision of technology as a bridge, not a barrier, is transforming how we think about innovation. I want to be part of that journey, not as the CEO of TechVant, but as someone who shares your commitment to making a real difference in the world. I love you, Elise. Not just the brilliant innovator or the passionate teacher, but all of you, your strength and your vulnerability, your dreams and your scars, your ability to rise from heartbreak and build something beautiful. I love the way you light up when talking about community impact, the careful thought you put into every design decision, the fierce protection you show for those who trust you. The question isn't whether you can trust me again. The question is, can we build something new together? Something that honors both our individual journeys and our shared vision of technology in service of humanity? Something that acknowledges past wounds while believing in future possibilities. I'm not the same person who failed you in that boardroom. These months in Detroit, learning from you and your community, have changed me fundamentally. The corporate mask I wore for so long has been replaced by authentic purpose. The fear that led me to betray your trust has been transformed into a commitment to standing up for what matters, regardless of the cost. You once told me that technology without humanity is just code. I've learned that success without purpose is just empty achievement, that power without responsibility is just privilege, that love without courage is just sentiment. Can we start again? Not from where we were, but from who we are now. Two people who understand loss and redemption, who believe in the power of technology to serve humanity, who know that real connections are built on truth and trust. I'll respect whatever decision you make, If you feel we can only be professional colleagues, I'll honor that. If you need more time, I'll wait. But know that regardless of your answer, the changes you've inspired in me and how I lead, how I think about technology's role in society, how I understand love and trust, those are permanent. Thank you for teaching me what really matters. Thank you for showing me that second chances must be earned through consistent action, not just promised through pretty words. Thank you for helping me become someone I can be proud to be. With deep respect and enduring hope, Brandon. He read the letter over one final time as dawn began to paint the Detroit sky in shades of pearl and gold. Every word was true, every sentiment genuine. Whether it would be enough to bridge the chasm his actions had created, he couldn't know. But at least she would have his complete truth. Carefully folding the pages, he placed them in an envelope with her name written in his precise handwriting. No titles, no formalities, just Elise, because titles had always been part of the wall between them. The snow had stopped, leaving the city wrapped in a pristine blanket of white. Brandon walked to Techtown early, wanting to place the letter on her desk before the day began. The building was quiet, most offices still dark. In her workspace, surrounded by whiteboards covered in interface designs and community feedback notes, he placed the envelope in the center of her desk. Then he left, knowing that the next move had to be hers. What he didn't know was that Elise had also arrived early that morning, and from the doorway of the break room, she watched him place the letter and walk away. Her hands trembled slightly as she picked up the envelope, recognizing that whatever words it contained would either close the door on their story forever or open the possibility of a new chapter. The city awakened slowly around her as she began to read, the winter sun casting long shadows across words that would change everything. Chapter 11. Healing Rain. A spring storm was brewing over Detroit when Elise's text finally came, 3 days after she'd found Brandon's letter on her desk. Belle Isle Park, Conservatory, 5 p.m. The message was brief, but it carried the weight of possibility in its simplicity. Brandon arrived early, watching storm clouds gather over the Detroit River as he waited near the historic Anna Scripps Whitcomb Conservatory. The Victorian-style glass building stood like a crystal palace against the darkening sky, its dome reaching toward heaven as if in prayer. Inside, thousands of plants created a sanctuary of green life, a perfect counterpoint to the industrial city beyond. The first drops of rain began to fall as Elise's car pulled into the parking lot. She emerged wearing a cream-colored sweater that seemed to glow against her skin, her natural hair styled in elegant twists. The letter was clutched in her hand, its pages showing signs of having been read multiple times. They met at the conservatory's entrance, the growing storm creating a sense of intimacy, as if the world beyond this moment had ceased to exist. For a long moment, neither spoke, letting the sound of rain on glass fill the space between them. "I've read it 12 times, Elise finally said, holding up the letter. Her voice was soft but steady. "Every word." "I meant every word," Brandon replied simply. She nodded, then turned to look at the rain-streaked gardens beyond the glass. "Walk with me?" "It's raining," he pointed out gently. "I know." A ghost of a smile touched her lips. Sometimes rain can be cleansing. They stepped out into the storm together, the warm spring rain immediately soaking through their clothes. Elise led them to a covered gazebo overlooking the river, where the downtown skyline was visible through the curtain of rain. "I was 19 when I met Aiden," she began, her voice barely audible above the storm. "It was my first week at U of M, and I was completely lost trying to find the computer science building. He was a sophomore, giving campus tours to high school students. He saw me standing there with my map upside down and just stopped his whole tour to help me." Brandon listened silently, understanding that this moment of sharing was sacred, that Elise was finally ready to tell him the complete story of her first love and devastating loss. "We were so young," she continued, a sad smile playing at her lips. "But we had everything planned out. He was going to teach high school science, inspire kids from our community to dream bigger. I was going to revolutionize healthcare technology. We were going to change the world together." She twisted the ring on her right hand, a gesture Brandon had come to recognize as both memory and anchor. The wedding was perfect, small, just family and close friends at our church. Aidan, her voice caught slightly, he'd saved for months to book us the presidential suite at the Detroit Marriott. He wanted everything to be special for our first night together. The rain intensified, but neither of them moved to seek better shelter. Something about the storm matched the emotional weight of the moment, as if nature itself was participating in this act of remembrance and release. "We were so careful," Elise continued, her voice taking on a distant quality. "Waiting until marriage, doing everything right. When the drunk driver ran that red light, I remember thinking it wasn't fair. We'd done everything right. We'd waited, we'd planned, we'd loved purely and completely. How could this happen to us?" Brandon's hand moved unconsciously toward hers, but he stopped himself, letting her control the moment, the distance, the pace of this sharing. "The hardest part wasn't the physical recovery," she said, finally turning to face him fully. "It was the dreams. Every night I'd dream of our future. The house we'd planned to buy in Boston Edison, the 3 kids we'd named, the life we'd mapped out. Then I'd wake up, and for a few seconds, everything would be normal. Those seconds of forgetting were almost worse than the grief itself." Lightning flashed across the river, followed by a low rumble of thunder. Elise hugged herself, but continued speaking as if a dam had broken and the words had to flow. "After the funeral, everyone kept telling me I was young, that I'd find love again, that time heals all wounds, but they didn't understand. It wasn't just Aidan I lost that night. It was innocence, faith, the belief that love conquers all. I lost the girl who believed in perfect endings." She took a step closer to Brandon, close enough that he could see the rain mingling with tears on her cheeks. "That's why Chicago scared me so much, because for the first time since Aidan I felt something real, something that made me want to believe again." "Elise," Brandon breathed her name like a prayer. "Let me finish," she said gently. "When you betrayed me in that boardroom, it confirmed every fear I'd developed after losing Aidan. That love isn't enough, that trusting people only leads to pain, that keeping your heart locked away is safer than risking it breaking again." She pulled out his letter, its pages protected in a plastic sleeve. "But this letter, and more importantly, your actions these past months, they've shown me something else. That maybe love isn't about safety or perfection. Maybe it's about choosing to be vulnerable again, about finding someone who's willing to earn back trust, even when it seems impossible." Thunder rolled again, closer now, but neither of them flinched. They stood in their own world, where only truth and healing mattered. "I don't want to be afraid anymore," Elise admitted, her voice stronger now. "I don't want to keep comparing every possibility to what I lost. Aidan will always be part of my story, my first love, the beginning of who I became, but maybe there's room for a new chapter." Brandon remained still, hardly daring to breathe, as she took another step toward him. Her hand, when it finally touched his, was warm despite the rain. "Your letter talked about building something new," she said softly, "not trying to recreate what was lost, but creating something different, something that honors who we are now, what we've learned, what we believe in." "Yes," he managed, his voice rough with emotion. "I can't promise it will be easy," she warned. "I have walls built from loss and betrayal. They won't come down overnight." "I don't want easy," Brandon replied, finally allowing his fingers to intertwine with hers. I want real. I want to earn every bit of trust you're willing to give, to build something authentic and lasting, step by step. Elise looked at their joined hands, then up at him through the rain. The woman you met in Chicago. She was still halfway living in the past, holding on to ghosts and what-ifs. The woman I am now. She's learned that love isn't about perfect moments or guaranteed futures. It's about choosing to be brave enough to try again. And the man I am now, Brandon said softly, has learned that real strength isn't about corporate power or maintaining control. It's about being vulnerable enough to admit mistakes, patient enough to earn back trust, and honest enough to love completely. The storm was directly overhead now, but in their gazebo by the river, Elise and Brandon had created a space where past and present, loss and hope, pain and possibility could coexist. When she finally stepped into his embrace, letting herself cry for all that was lost and all that might be found, it felt like the most natural thing in the world. They held each other as the storm raged and gradually passed, their clothes soaked but their hearts lighter. The rain that had begun as nature's accompaniment to grief became a baptism of sorts, washing away old pain and nurturing new growth. When they finally pulled apart, the sun was breaking through the clouds, creating a rainbow over the Detroit River. Neither of them mentioned the symbolism, but both felt it, the promise of beauty after storms, of hope after darkness, of love after loss. "Come on," Elise said softly, taking his hand again. "I want to show you something." She led him through the conservatory's rain-washed gardens to a quiet corner where white roses bloomed. "Aiden proposed to me here," she said, her voice steady now. "It seems right to start something new in the same place, a way of honoring the past while choosing the future." Brandon understood the significance of what she was offering, not just a chance at love, but a place in her complete story, past and present intertwined. They stood among the roses as the last raindrops fell, two people who had learned that love isn't about perfect beginnings, but about the courage to begin again. The Detroit sky cleared to a brilliant blue, the storm leaving everything washed clean and new. Above them, birds began to sing again, their songs a reminder that after every storm, life continues, grows, and flourishes in new ways. Chapter 12. New Beginnings. The morning after their reconciliation at Belle Isle Park dawned with a crystalline clarity that seemed to mirror the newfound understanding between Brandon and Elise. The spring storm had washed Detroit clean, leaving behind a world that felt renewed, reborn, ready for fresh possibilities. Brandon arrived at Techtown early, his heart lighter than it had been in months, only to find Elise already in her office. She sat surrounded by papers and diagrams, her natural hair still slightly damp from the previous night's rain, her eyes bright with an energy he hadn't seen since Chicago. "I couldn't sleep," she explained as he appeared in her doorway. "After everything yesterday, I kept thinking about what you said in Chicago, about technology serving humanity, and suddenly everything clicked." She gestured to the designs spread across her desk. "I think I know how we can make it real, not just for Detroit, but everywhere." Brandon stepped into the office, drawn by the fire in her eyes. On her whiteboard, she had sketched out a vision that took his breath away, a complete reimagining of how technology companies could serve communities. It wasn't just a business plan, it was a revolution in how Silicon Valley could work with local innovators. The Innovation Fund was just the beginning, Elise explained, her hands moving animatedly as she spoke. "Look at what we've learned through the workshops, through the community health initiatives. What if we created something bigger? A new model of technology development that starts with community needs and builds up instead of pushing solutions down." She walked him through her vision. a revolutionary approach that would combine TechVant's resources with Healthbridge's community-centered methodology. The technical architecture was brilliant, but it was the human element that made it truly revolutionary. This would mean completely restructuring how both companies operate, Brandon observed, studying the detailed framework she'd developed. The board would see the potential, Elise finished confidently. She pulled up financial projections that made even his experienced eyes widen. This isn't just about doing good, though that matters. It's about creating a sustainable model for ethical, community-centered tech development, something that could be replicated across the country. Brandon looked at her, really looked at her, and saw not just the woman he loved, but a visionary partner who could help him transform everything he'd built into something truly meaningful. The passion that had first drawn them together in Chicago was there, but tempered now with wisdom, with understanding, with shared purpose. "When did you develop all this?" he asked, amazed by the depth and detail of her plans. "I've been working on it since Chicago," she admitted softly. "Even after everything. I couldn't let go of the vision we shared that night, but I needed to know I could trust not just your heart, but your commitment to real change." Brandon's throat tightened with emotion. All those months he'd spent attending her workshops, learning about community-centered development, she'd been watching, evaluating not just his personal growth, but his readiness to revolutionize the very nature of technology development. "Last night in the park," she continued, her voice growing stronger, "when you held me while I cried about Aiden, I realized something. What happened in that boardroom, as painful as it was, led us here. It forced both of us to confront what really matters, to understand that love isn't just about personal connection, it's about sharing a vision, fighting for what's right, building something meaningful together." She touched the ring that now hung on a chain around her neck. No longer just a symbol of loss, but a reminder of how past love could inspire future purpose. Then her other hand found Brandon's, their fingers intertwining naturally. "What happened with Aiden taught me that life can change in an instant," she said softly. "But what happened with you taught me that change isn't always an ending. Sometimes it's a beginning, a chance to build something new, something that honors the past while creating a different kind of future." Brandon pulled her close, feeling her heart beat against his chest. "Show me everything," he whispered into her hair. "Let's build this vision together." They spent the next hours hunched over her designs, refining and expanding her vision. Their professional expertise merged seamlessly with their personal understanding, each strengthening the other. This wasn't just a business plan or a romance. It was the fusion of both, a shared mission born from their individual journeys of loss and redemption. As the sun began to set over Detroit, casting long shadows through her office window, Brandon realized something profound. Their story wasn't just about second chances in love. It was about the power of transformation, personal and professional, individual and systemic. "Are you ready for this?" he asked, looking at the comprehensive plan they'd developed together. "It won't be easy. Some people will resist." Elise's smile held all the strength and wisdom she'd gained through her journey. "Then we'll show them what's possible when you combine Silicon Valley innovation with Detroit's resilience. When you merge corporate resources with community wisdom, when you let love guide not just your heart, but your vision." She reached up to touch the ring on her chain, then took Brandon's hand. The gesture symbolized everything they'd become. A partnership that honored the past while building the future, a love strong enough to survive betrayal and emerge stronger, a shared commitment to making technology serve humanity. "Ready to change the world?" she asked softly. Brandon pulled her close, finally able to hold her without reservation or fear. "With you, I'm ready for anything." As night fell over Detroit, they stood together at her office window, watching the City lights come alive. Behind them, their revolutionary vision filled whiteboards and computer screens. Before them stretched a future neither could have imagined when they first met in Chicago, one where personal healing and professional purpose merged into something greater than either could have achieved alone. In the end, their story wasn't just about shattered hearts finding wholeness again. It was about how love, when combined with shared purpose and unwavering commitment to what's right, could transform not just two lives, but entire communities. It was about the power of second chances, not just to heal what was broken, but to build something entirely new and beautiful from the pieces. And somewhere they both knew Aidan was smiling, proud of the woman who had learned to love again, and the man who had learned what love truly meant. And in the end, they were blessed with a beautiful daughter. Subscribe if you enjoyed.